but I decided to take this deck to ruin this event, and I think that's why it made people very upset.
How did one-man strategy nearly sabotage an entire Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament for over 1,000 players? This is a story of a man who surprised the world with a toxic strategy that no one wanted to play against. It was a stall deck that had the potential to hold up a tournament for hours longer than it was supposed to be. And it got to the point where even if the judges wanted to disqualify him, they couldn't because he was still technically playing within the rules. A fact that would be rather ironic, for 22-year-old Alan Pennington himself was previously the most well-known head judge in Florida. But after openly criticizing Konami policies online, he would be barred from enlisting as a head judge for future tournaments, a canon event that would unleash the start of his villain saga.
2 weeks before the regional, RTO gets an email basically explicitly saying that they are not allowed to have me as a head judge. It was because of the fact that I had been criticizing Konami's policies online. So these were things like, I didn't like all the power creep. I thought the prize support could be a lot better, so on, So yeah, online I was posting some things about Konami.
And left unable to oversee the tournaments as a head judge, he instead turned his focus to joining them as a player, with his eyes set on an upcoming major event, YCS San Diego, a championship level tournament that would draw the strongest players from the continent. But he would have some time to prepare, with several local tournaments and smaller regional qualifiers to first test his theories. And through his research, one particular strategy would catch his attention. Originally surfacing at a regional by a fellow duelist with the name of Tyler Nolan, it was the first iteration of what would be called the Gishki FTK. The concept was pretty simple: use draw spells to draw as much of his own deck as possible, and then use cards like hand destruction and card destruction to force the opponent to draw multiple cards until they eventually decked out.
Tyler Nolan, very, very good player. He posts a tournament report of him going 6-3 at a regional with Gishki FTK. And this kind of mostly flew under the radar because, hey, it's a regional. He went 6-3. Who cares? Tyler was kind of on the same wavelength as me in that we were not really what we would call meta players. And I was like, this is pretty much like the pinnacle of a weird combo deck.
Now, to achieve this, over half of the deck would be composed of draw cards, ranging from Upstart Goblin to Into the Void, Trade-In, Moray of Greed, Dark World Dealings, and of course the newly released One Day Apiece, a card that would force both players to draw a card, but also prevent any damage being dealt for the next 2 turns.
I always like to push games to their limits. Show me something broken, and then let me come up with something even more broken.
But you might be wondering how a deck out situation would be possible, because the opponent would technically have to draw almost 40 cards to deck out. And with card destruction being limited to 1 copy per deck due to rampant abuse in the past, this might prove to be a challenge. But they quickly discovered it was possible to easily recycle card destruction and hand destruction with an engine that everyone had previously disregarded: the Gishki engine.
Gishki FTK is a combo deck. Play a bunch of draw spells, draw your entire deck. Then you put your graveyard back into your deck, draw your entire deck again, your graveyard back into your deck, draw your entire deck again. And you could keep doing this as long as you want. It is an infinite, non-deterministic combo.
Mainly in part due to its titular card, the Evagishki Mind August. This card would allow the user to recycle back 5 cards from either graveyard back to the owner's deck, meaning they could recycle card destruction quite easily. The Gishki ritual spell, Gishki Aquamirror, had a built-in graveyard effect that could shuffle itself back to the deck and then return a Gishki ritual monster in your graveyard back to your hand, creating a failsafe that prevents the user from decking out, but also allowing them to recycle the resources so they can loop Evagishki Mind August over and over again. And of course, being older cards released before the designers imposed a hard once per turn restriction, both of these cards could be activated as many times as you wanted. And with 3 copies of Aquamirror and 2 copies of Mind August, you could essentially create a pseudo-infinite loop.
You want to design a game? Okay, make you earn your paycheck. I'm going to show you the worst possible consequences of your game design.
They would try and draw their entire deck, a feat that was attained pretty easily with the amount of draw spells that the deck played. And of course, this was over a decade ago where hand traps were not very prevalent. Ash Blossom Joy Spring was not a thing, so you could not stop the effect of draw spells. And even though Drone Lockbird was released, no one was really playing it because back then the decks didn't do any searching, so there was nothing you could really side it against besides this deck, which no one really knew about. Effect Veiler was around, but it was pretty useless against the best decks, so it didn't see a lot of play. And against Gishki, it was somewhat effective against Royal Magical Library, but that was really about it.
The only relevant hand traps against Gishki FTK were Nico Money King and Droll and Lockbird. and people did not side those cards because they were literally unplayable against every other deck in the format.
Once the deck was empty, Mind August could then recycle a copy of Hand Destruction and Salvage. A second copy of Hand Destruction would then be activated from the hand to draw the Salvage and the Hand Destruction that was returned to the deck, while burning 2 cards from the opponent's deck at the same time. 2 copies of Gishki Aquamirror then return themselves to the deck to add back the Mind August and fodder to hand, followed by Salvage adding back 2 copies of Gishki Shadow, then searching those same Aquamirrors. This would allow another copy of August to be resummoned, shuffling back Salvage and Hand Destruction to the deck once more, allowing the freshly drawn Hand Destruction to then repeat the process, discarding Aquamirror for free each time thanks to Salvage's resource management. The Aquamirrors spin themselves back to the deck for Shadow to research to hand, providing infinite Mind Augusts, who then recycle infinite Hand Destructions and Salvages, creating a bizarre but infinite loop, all while slowly decking out the opponent every time Hand Destruction resolves. Interestingly enough, the rest of the Gishki engine also supported the consistency of this combo. Gishki Shadow could be discarded to search for Gishki Aquamirror, while Gishki Vision could be discarded to search for either Mind August or Soul Ogre, another Gishki ritual monster used solely as a level 8 body to discard with trade-in. And here is why the strategy was extremely toxic, because the combo took extremely long to execute. It wasn't an infinite combo, so to speak, because the combo lines would be different, so you couldn't just declare an infinite loop and say that you were conducting it over and over again. You had to physically play the cards each time, and despite a match of Yu-Gi-Oh! Being a best 2 out of 3, oftentimes the first game would take well over 40 minutes, leading to a timeout situation where they would win inevitably after conducting the loop, and because there was only enough time for one game, there would not be a game 2 or a game 3, meaning that the Gishki player inevitably wins on the spot.
What you can do, and what I did, I believe 4 times during this 9-round regional, was decking out my opponent on game 1, turn 1, after time has been called, and therefore you win the entire match 1-0.
This, of course, meant that if you were sitting across the table from a deck like this, the counter strategy was to concede once you saw that they had the infinite loop going, so you had enough time to play a game 2 and a 3, where you could also take advantage of your side deck.
You have to scoop, or I'm going to time you out on game 1. I mean, you know, you're comboing me. I know I'm not going to win. I'm just going to scoop to save time. But the idea of scooping to save time was a foreign concept to people back then. The only people that were scooping were people that were told about my deck by their friends and were like, hey, if you play this guy, make sure you scoop.
But of course, with the strategy being rather new, no one really understood this, so they would just sit there and watch the player combo. But at the same time, there was a conundrum for the opponent because there was always a chance of the Gishki deck fizzling. Even after drawing the majority of the deck, surprisingly, there's a mathematical chance that the user does not assemble the infinite combo, or if they actually mess up one of their sequences, there's a chance that they have to pass turn without executing the full loop. So conceding early would actually be a mistake for the player. And surprisingly, this would happen during testing for Alan when he was close to fizzling and his opponent conceded. But the deck also had a glaring weakness. It wasn't very good going second. If the opponent could set up a monster negate to stop the Royal Magical Library from accumulating counters for a free draw, or utilize preemptive hand destruction like Moonling Glacia the Elemental Lord, then the game would pretty much be over immediately for the Gishki player. Yet in spite of these flaws, Tyler Nolan would still finish his regional with a 6-3 record. But the deck would be brushed off by the masses as a meme-worthy deck because it didn't reach the top 16 of that regional. Alan, on the other hand, had an affinity for playing strange combo decks, and the Gishki FTK would certainly pique his interest. He would then take the same strategy himself to another regional tournament with 400 players, even bringing a bingo checklist form just to see how much damage it could actually cause. With some notable achievements including winning a duel with at least 30 cards in his hand, get a judge called on him at least 5 times in a single match, and get verbally or physically assaulted by an angry mob of duelists, which luckily was not checked off.
So I decided to show up to this regional, and I was, kind of in a vengeful mood, and I decided to take this Gishki FTK deck, but I decided to take this deck to ruin this event.
And notably, in this tournament, he would time out at least 5 of his opponents, some of which got extremely salty and even called the judge. In fact, one player would return the favor of Sabotage by deliberately cutting his deck even if there were only 2 or 3 cards left, and asking him about every single card effect. A strategy that would prove to be rather ineffective, for he would eventually time out and lose because of it, adding more fuel to the butthurt.
Getting mad at me for playing Gishki FTK, and I'm like, no, this isn't my problem. This is Konami's problem. They're the one trying to promote this gameplay. I'm just taking it to its logical extreme.
But through his testing, he would also realize that the deck had a slight counter within the format in the form of Thunder King Ryo. This was a card that would prevent him from utilizing his Gishki cards to search his deck, effectively shutting off the 6 Gishki effect monsters that would search for Aqua Mirror or Mind August. But as long as he had draw power, he could consistently summon out a large Gishki ritual monster and then proceed to swing over Ryo by battle, continuing to combo in main phase 2. And everything went relatively as planned, for he would finish with a 7-2 record overall, barely losing in the last round and missing out on the top 8 cut. The players in the hall were so disgusted, many of which complained to the judges and the tournament organizers, and an active Konami representative who was present on the scene would even ask Alan how to best hit the deck on the next ban list.
At that regional, there was a Konami employee there, and he actually like explicitly asked me, is like, you know, he's like, hey, I know that you haven't broken any rules, so to speak, but like, what can we do to hit this deck? Well, the obvious thing would just be a limit 1 day apiece. In the games where you don't FTK with the deck, go, well, I'm gonna 1 day apiece you can't deal any damage to me. Oh, it's back to me again. Okay, and now I'll kill you.
Now, 7-2 with such a deck at a 400-man regional was actually something respectable, and word of his performance would begin to spread online, with many more complaining on the forums, some of who would even email Konami.
Why do you think people hate you?
I don't mind calling people bad if they are bad.
But luckily for the community, the R&D team would hear their cries, and on the next ban list, 1 day apiece would be limited to 1 copy per deck, severely hampering its consistency and turtle up strategy. And the community would be satisfied for what they thought was an adequate hit to make the deck disappear completely. But they were wrong. With YCS San Diego just a few weeks away, Alan didn't give up. He continued testing the deck, replacing 1 day apiece with Cup of Ace as an additional draw engine, though at a slightly higher gamble. Now, Cup of Ace was a really interesting card. It's basically a pot of greed that nets the user 2 additional cards, but only if you win the 50-50 coin toss. On the flip side, if the user loses a coin toss, not only does the opponent draw 2 cards, but the user also loses a card from the hand in the form of a Cup of Ace that netted 0 advantage. But together with Tyler Nolan, they determined that Cup of Ace was the card with the highest mathematical chance of still winning the duel, and therefore the most adequate replacement for 1 day apiece.
What I came up with is Cup of Ace. Say if you have like 2 Cup of Aces and one of them draws you 2, the other one draws your opponent 2. That's actually fine and sometimes can even be helpful, because one strategy that people can use against Gishki is to just set like a bunch of back rows, because then you can't legally activate hand destruction, right? Because you need 2 cards in your hand to legally activate hand destruction, because I can take advantage of the ones that draw me cards and the ones that draw you cards by making my hand destructions, you know, legally able to be activated.
Despite hurting the deck, the ban list would also help it indirectly by hurting its bad matchups. For starters, number 16 Shockmaster was finally banned, a card that previously meant immediate loss for the deck should they win the Dairo and call spells. Now, YCS San Diego was particularly unique, and it was different from the standard Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship series. Instead of using a constructed deck, for the first 9 rounds of day 1, they would be forced to build a sealed deck from 6 packs of Battle Pack, with a 7-2 or better record required to make day 2, where Alan would then play 5 more rounds using his Gishki deck. Surprisingly, this actually made the deck a lot more viable, given that there were less rounds with it, which meant less Dairos, less variants, and ultimately a lower chance to fizzle out, providing the deck a solid chance to top if he could muster at least a 3-2 record with solid tiebreakers. The YCS tournament would begin with the judge handing Alan a deck box containing one of the worst sealed pools he had ever seen. Gore's the Emissary of Darkness, Solemn Judgment, Mirror Force, or Damage Step battle modifiers like Forbidden Lance were key cards in the sealed pool, but his deck would contain none of these, beyond one lone copy of Heavy Storm as his sole power card.
I actually opened like a horrible sealed pool. I did not open a lot of power cards, but I still went 7-2. I credit that to a lot of playtesting with Michael Lux.
But unlike the majority of other players in the room, what he did have was practice. The man had taken ample time before the event to carefully research all of the niche interactions and the cards in the set, having purchased multiple cases just to practice with his friends in the weeks leading up to the tournament. Though he would be forced to endure a battle of attrition as the decks got better and better with every consecutive match that he won, he miraculously finished with a 7-2 record, defeating national champion Patrick Holben on the last round of day 1, granting him access to day 2 where the real tournament would begin. And on the next day, Alan woke up knowing that he was about to send a wake-up call to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, the likes of which they have never seen before. But unlike at the regional where the deck was a completely new concept, by now a lot of the players had caught on to the fundamentals and the basics of how the deck worked, having spread word online of his performance at that regional.
At the regional, there's much more of a reaction. Again, they were just flabbergasted. Like, what is this deck? What is this guy doing? Why is he taking so much time? Oh my God, what the hell is happening? But again, by the time the YCS rolled around, most people were kind of vaguely aware of the deck at least.
But at times, players would still try to play out game 1, with the match ending in a 1-0 victory for Alan as the timer hit 0. And as he reached the top tables, crowds would start forming around him to witness the toxicity happen in real time. But the man was rather attuned to the deck, so he would play at a reasonable pace, therefore the judges could not give him any slow play warnings. Nevertheless, he would feel the gaze of the judges upon his shoulder, but he would frequently remind his opponents that they could concede at any point in time, so the judges wouldn't think he was stalling or using the time maliciously in his favor. With 5 rounds in day 2, he would start with a 3-1 finish, requiring only one more win to make it into the top 32 cut, where the playoff would begin. And at this point, his utmost skill with the deck would be challenged, for his opponent was none other than Robbie Boyajian, a previous YCS champion. Not only was he a phenomenal player, but he also knew how the deck worked fundamentally because he had friends who had texted him previously before the match about conceding early. But for some reason, he wouldn't concede early enough, leading to time being called during siding after game 1, which meant that Alan would be declared a 1-0 victory, propelling him into the top 32.
What I believe happened is that he was trying to set up a situation where we would draw the match, because if we drew, we would both make top 32. And it's a horrible matchup for him. So he pretty much knows that unless I get very unlucky, he's not going to win. So we're going into game 2 with 1 minute left on the clock. Time was called while I was still figuring out which 10 cards to take out for my 10 burn cards. They were like, nope, you don't play game 2. What's the score? And the answer was 1-0. So I won that match 1-0. Certainly upset my opponent. Some of the players watching, they assumed that like, oh, I'm just sitting there thinking about siding, trying to drain the clock. And it's like, no, I was legitimately siding. The judges, however, knew that, right? They had my deck list.
It was then that the judges began to sweat just a little bit because they knew the venue would have to be closed at a certain point in time, but with only a few hours left during the day, they had to make sure that the tournament was not stalled. And after a quick little huddle to discuss their options, it was determined that Alan's deck still had a win condition, and the deck was actively playing to achieve that win condition despite taking a long time. But he hadn't broken any policies, so his reign of terror on the tournament would continue. But no matter what happened, Alan knew that he had already accomplished his goal, achieving what many would have thought to be impossible. Topping a premier level event was such a toxic strategy. Now, this was a time before live stream feature matches were a thing, so the only coverage we received was that of a written blog on the official Yu-Gi-Oh website. Now, the only problem with this was the fact that they didn't want to feature him.
No, I've specifically been told not to feature you. Konami wanted to bury this. I was really hoping that I could make it to top 2 or at least top 4, just because then they would be forced to feature my deck.
So the only real-time updates about Alan's success were posted by people who were actually there at the tournament onto online forums. His top 32 opponent was none other than the Jeff Jones himself, one of the most accomplished players in the history of the entire game, having won and topped an endless number of premier events throughout his tenure. Jeff's expression would contort as Alan won the die roll, electing to go first in the single elimination round that would eventually crown the tournament champion. But luck would not be on Alan's side, for he would draw his hand and quickly fizzle into the combo, having missed multiple coin tosses for cup of ace. Now, losing game 1 this early with the deck was pretty much a death sentence, because even if you win game 2, in game 3 the Murmo player can set up a Mulan Glacia to discard 2 cards from your hand, as well as a Abyss Kaios that can negate cards like Royal Magical Library.
How'd you beat the Gishki guy?
Well, to start off, I rolled a 10. I was pretty confident I was going to go first, which was really good. But then he rolled an 11, so I thought I was going to lose, but he fizzled on his turn 1, which is pretty lucky for me, I guess. Game 2, he played Dark World Dealings. I could discard an Abyss Gundy and bring back a Spike Digit Infantry to kill the library, but by the time he played Dark World Dealings, it was later in the game, and it already didn't matter. Game 3, I went first. My hand was pretty mediocre. My best play was to summon the Spike, discard the Dragoons, search Abyss Lead, discard 3 monsters for Abyss Lead, and pop a random card from his hand, and hope that it just got me there, and it ended up being enough.
But as the 2 water strategies collided, eventually the smoke would clear, and Jeff Jones would declare victory over Alan and his Gishki FTK strategy. The players and the judges in the hall let out a huge sigh of relief, erupting into a cheer as Jeff Jones got up from his seat, having eliminated the toxic strategy that could have sabotaged their entire weekend. And the rest of the tournament would continue as normal, completely devoid of that possibility. But Alan would still leave the table with a smile on his face, knowing that he had achieved the unthinkable. His performance would trigger a chain reaction online, and by the end of the weekend, the community was filled with disgust. With complaints sprouting across online forums, pro players would even write guides on how to best defeat the strategy, shedding light about when to concede against it and the most impactful cards to negate. A portion of the community even started side decking cards just to beat the deck, with Nico Mane King and Drone Lockbird some of the most popular choices. But while most hated the idea of such a strategy existing, others reveled in the chaos and even celebrated his accomplishment. But of course, when any community is in this much of an uproar, by the following ban list, Evigishki Mind August would become limited to 1 per deck, effectively bringing an end to the near infinite loop. And although the deck could technically still make an infinite loop with just 1 copy of Mind August, by then the exponentially expanding power creep of the game, as well as the reduced consistency of the Gishki deck, meant that it would forever fade into obscurity.
Whether or not I ruined the event, at the end of the day, that is an opinion. That's certainly the view that some people had. I mean, again, a lot of people had this attitude. They had this box of like what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is supposed to be. And if you were like outside of that box, you were sort of ruining it for everyone else. You're just sort of drawing an arbitrary line in the sands. Like, okay, it's fair for like windups to just Shockmaster you turn 1 and then OTK you on turn 2, but then it's not fair for me to just deck you out on turn 1. Like, why should a distinction be made there?
But what happened to the man himself, Alan Pennington, you might ask? Well, after cementing an unforgettable legacy within the competitive history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, he would quit the game and switch to Magic the Gathering instead. He also started a rapping career.
Going through the room, buying all the binders. I'm a Yu-Gi-Oh! Baller and I always fresh, never wear a dirty tee. Never drop a game, so I say GG.
Yet still periodically coming back to the game and topping at premier events. But today, he still dabbles in retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats, including Gold Control, where he has a YouTube channel, as well as another YouTube channel talking about his lifestyle in Asia.